Most people think the powdered wig was just a quirky, if slightly ridiculous fashion statement of the 18th century. We see them in oil paintings and period dramas, a symbol of colonial elegance, high society etiquette, and the refined courts of Europe. Think again. These towering white clouds of hair weren't designed for style. They were built to cover up a rotting secret. Beneath the perfectly curled rose and the clouds of scented lavender lay a grim reality of venereal disease, parasitic infestation, and a biological slurry of sweat and lead. The first wigs weren't accessories, they were bandages for a social wound that was eating Europe alive. What we perceive today as the height of aristocratic vanity was actually a desperate, scratching attempt to hide the fact that the elite were literally falling apart. To understand the wig, we must first understand the plague that birthed it. Long before the guillotine severed the heads of the aristocracy, a microscopic killer was already claiming their scalps. By 1580, a specific disease had swept through Europe with terrifying speed, filling hospitals and emptying bank accounts. It was known by many names: the French disease, the Great Pox, or simply syphilis. In an era before antibiotics, syphilis was a death sentence, but a slow, humiliating one. It didn't just cause madness and open sores, it targeted the very thing that men of the era prized most: their hair. In a world where long flowing locks denoted virility, strength, and status, going bald wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It was a public admission of guilt, a neon sign that screamed to the court, "I am diseased." The outbreak was so severe that it reshaped the social fabric of London and Paris. We aren't talking about a mild receding hairline here. We are talking about patchy, moth-eaten clumps of hair falling out in public, often accompanied by weeping lesions and facial disfigurement. The Great Pox was stripping the dignity from the upper classes, and they needed a solution that was as large and distracting as possible. The stigma was unbearable. Hair loss was the first visible symptom of the pox, often accompanied by open sores on the scalp that refused to heal. But the horror didn't stop at the disease itself. The treatment was arguably worse. The primary medical intervention at the time involved mercury, a heavy metal we now know is a potent neurotoxin. Patients were locked in hot boxes and slathered in toxic mercury pastes to sweat out the disease. The irony is sharp. The cure was often as damaging as the illness. Mercury poisoning caused excessive salivation, tooth loss, and, crucially, accelerated the hair loss they were trying to hide. Imagine the psychological toll. You are suffering from a painful, shameful disease, and the doctor's only remedy is to poison you until your remaining hair falls out. Baldness became social suicide. It implied you were rotting from the inside out, a pariah in a society obsessed with surface appearances. So, the aristocracy needed a cover-up, literally. They began crafting hairpieces not out of vanity, but out of necessity. They were hiding the physical evidence of their own moral corruption, plastering over the sores with horsehair and glue. Here's where history gets fascinating. The trend didn't truly explode until it reached the very top of the food chain. When Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, began losing his hair at the tender age of 17, panic set in. The most powerful man in Europe, the absolute monarch who believed he was appointed by God, could not be seen as a balding, syphilitic weakling. He hired 40 dedicated wig makers to save his image. These weren't subtle toupees, they were massive architectural feats of hair designed to distract and intimidate. Louis popularized the periwig, a cascading mountain of dark curls that flowed down the back and over the shoulders. It was a power move. And because the king did it, the court had to follow. To be seen without a wig was to be seen as naked. Across the channel, his cousin King Charles II of England began doing the same to hide his own graying, thinning locks. Suddenly, the shame of the Great Pox became the height of European fashion. The wig transformed from a medical necessity into a symbol of divine right. But while the wigs hid the sores, they created a new, living nightmare. The aristocracy had traded one form of filth for another. Here is where the irony bites. To look clean, the aristocracy became walking ecosystems of filth. These wigs were made of horse, goat, or human hair. Human hair was the most expensive, often sourced from the dead or the desperate poor who sold their locks for a meal. But once constructed, these hairpieces were never washed. Hygiene in the 17th and 18th centuries was optional. Bathing was considered dangerous, thought to open the pores to miasmas and disease. So people rarely washed their bodies, and they absolutely never washed their wigs. Instead, they coated them in powder. The recipe for this powder was a disaster waiting to happen. It was a mixture of starch, usually finely ground wheat flour, scented with lavender or orange flower to mask the smell of the unwashed animal hair and the unwashed human scalp beneath it. To achieve that stark, brilliant white look that signified nobility, they often mixed in lead or arsenic. So picture this. You have a heavy, hot mat of horsehair sitting on a sweaty, unwashed head, dusted with flour and toxic heavy metals. It was a biological pressure cooker. The wigs were warm, dark, and humid. They were the perfect incubator for lice. The infestation was so rampant that it birthed its own etiquette and tools. It got so bad that scratching with your fingers wasn't enough, nor was it polite. Ladies and gentlemen carried long, scratching rods, elaborate sticks made of whalebone, ivory, or gold, to dig into their fake hair at the dinner table without toppling the structure. Imagine a machine that converts status into suffering. At night, the situation was even grimmer. You couldn't sleep in these monstrosities. When the wigs were removed, they were often set out on stands where the vermin would crawl freely. The infestation was so persistent that people would boil their wigs or bake them in bread ovens to kill the nits. The smell of burning hair and roasted lice became a familiar scent in the backrooms of the elite. And it wasn't just lice. The flour used to powder the wigs attracted other pests. There are accounts of mice nesting inside the larger, more elaborate wigs while they were being stored. The aristocracy was literally carrying a food source for rodents on their heads. They had turned themselves into walking buffets for the animal kingdom, all in the name of superiority, the crime of fashion. The value of these lice nests was astronomical. A full ceremonial wig could cost as much as 25 guineas, more than a commoner earned in a year. This gave rise to a new, specialized breed of criminal, the wig snatcher. London streets became dangerous for the well-coiffed. Thieves would cut holes in the backs of carriages to swipe wigs off the heads of unsuspecting nobles as they sat in traffic. In the streets, they used tall baskets with false bottoms. A thief would walk past a gentleman, drop the basket over his head, and lift the prize right off his scalp in the confusion. It was a chaotic economy where hair was currency and your dignity could be stolen in the blink of an eye. The government eventually saw an opportunity to capitalize on this absurdity. In 1795, the British government introduced a tax on hair powder. If you wanted to play the part of the elite, you had to pay for the privilege. But by then, the tide was already turning, and the wig was about to face a much sharper instrument than a scratching rod. The starvation of vanity. The cost wasn't just financial, it was moral. The powder used to whiten these hives of vermin was, as we mentioned, largely made of wheat flour. This was the same flour used to make bread, the staple food of the peasantry. While the poor starved in the streets of Paris due to grain shortages, the rich were literally dusting their hair with food. The wig became a symbol of a disconnect so deep it would eventually lead to the guillotine. It was the theater of power, performed on a stage of famine. When the French Revolution hit, wearing a powdered wig wasn't just unfashionable, it was a death warrant. It marked you as a target. The revolutionaries didn't just want to remove the wigs, they wanted to remove the heads underneath them. The era of the big wig ended not with a whimper, but with the sharp drop of a blade. The revolution killed the wig in France, but look at the British legal system today. The tradition survives, a ghost of a bygone era. We still associate these hairpieces with wisdom, authority, and law, forgetting they were invented to hide venereal disease, open sores, and shame. Ask yourself, are you looking at a symbol of justice or are you looking at a cover-up? Because some fashion statements are far deadlier and dirtier than they appear.